Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack and today I'm going to talk to you about why one of these two fantastic cars is actually overvalued. I'm going to illustrate my reasoning in lots of ways. So we're going to look at production numbers, and look at the actual technicals behind these cars, the way they were built, the chassis, the engine, and we're going to look at running costs as well, which is one of the things that normally would make you think that the Ferrari is going to be more expensive to run, whereas in actual fact that's not always going to be the case. What we have here is a Ferrari 308 1979 and a 1987, 88? And a 1988 Carrera 3.2. Now these two cars, they sort of ran into each other with the SCs and also the 328s. Both were developments, but for the sake of today, these are the two cars that we're going to be talking about, but the argument holds for sort of both lots. A nice 3.2 with the same mileage as a nice Ferrari 308, generally in the UK they're about the same value. Perhaps a 3.2 with the same mileage would actually be even more expensive. We're not going to consider the special versions. For example, on this there is the CS, the Club Sport version, which is a lot more expensive. And with 308s, the initial Vetroresina cars, which are actually built in fiberglass, they are also way more expensive. Funnily enough, probably about the same sort of values as the CS, but we're just talking about the standard cars for the purpose of this video. Values for these go from about £40,000 for one of the ones that needs a bit of work and a bit of love and care, to the very best low mileage cars, which can go up to sort of 70, 80,000. What I'm going to tell you is undoubtedly going to be controversial, and that is that the 3.2 Porsche Carrera, the famous 911, is the car that for me is overvalued. Now just bear with me, don't jump down my throat straight away. So here we have a 1979 Ferrari 308. These first came out in 1975, as I said before, initially because they didn't know how many they were going to sell. They made them with fiberglass bodies because the tooling for the steel bodies is really expensive. Once they saw there was big demand, they moved on to steel, and this is one of the steel-bodied cars. It has a naturally aspirated 3-litre V8. It's liquid-cooled, it has double wishbone suspension, discs all round. For the time, it was actually quite an advanced car. It has that lovely open gate 5-speed gearbox with a dogleg first. And it is finished in the traditional fabulous Ferrari red. I don't know if this has a specific name code or anything like that for it, but that's pretty much what it is. And here we have what I have to admit is a really pretty 1988 3.2 911. These were an evolution of the SC. There isn't a huge amount of difference with the SC apart from the engine being bored out, putting out a bit more power. The Ferrari puts out 250 horsepower. This puts out 230. They are supposed to be roughly the same weight, if you believe the manufacturer's figures. I tend to prefer to believe Porsche, to be honest, on that than Ferrari, but they are supposed to weigh about the same, so the Ferrari should by rights be a little bit quicker. But rather than being mid-mounted, liquid-cooled and double wishbone suspension, this has a rear-mounted air-cooled, it's really oil-cooled, but air-cooled engine, and it has torsion beam suspension at the rear. To be quite honest, this really is a triumph of development over design. There is just no way that this should work. However, having driven both, I can tell you, this is a really good car to drive. I really like 3.2s. So Porsche have really done the impossible, but you do have to be aware that in terms of development and everything else, the 308, God, it was a much more advanced car. This goes back to the Stone Age in comparison if you're just looking at spec. So it's amazing that they drive as well as they do. So the Ferrari certainly at its time was more advanced, but what about production numbers? After all, demand is often led by scarcity. So if a classic is quite rare, it's often worth more as long as it is still a nice car and not something horrible. Now with these two, let me give you some figures. So 308s and 328s, which are ran comparable times to the SC and the 3.2, there was overall production of 9,800 of the first series of these, plus 7,412 of the QV, the Quattro Valvole version, which came afterwards and ran some of the same time as the 3.2s. So all in all, we are looking at about 16,000 produced all in all of these. Incidentally, the GTSs like this one with the Targa top, they were actually far more common than the coupe versions, the GTBs. On the 911s, how many were produced? Well, 58,000 SCs were produced between 1978 and 1984. 58,000. 3.2s from 1984 to 1988 or 89, 150,000. So all in all, 208,000 of these were produced, as opposed to about 16,000 of these. Now, you can definitely argue, and I'm sure it's true, that a lot more of the originals of these will have survived because they've been pampered more, they've been used a lot less, very true. A lot of these were used as dailies and they had accidents and, you know, they've just been written off. But all the same, you can look in the classifieds, and if you look for 308s versus this era 911, they're outnumbered by at least 6 to 1, I would say. So these, even now, way more common than the 308. So again, you ask yourself a question, well, they're both nice cars, they both have a certain amount of appeal, so why then is the price the same? Okay, so you have a rarer car, a more exclusive car, something that some people, don't listen to this, Al, so the owner of the car, has been a real sport and he's bought a 3.2 here, but don't listen to it. Some people would say this is a more exclusive car, like a more, you know, more interesting car. You would, off the top of your mind, you see it and you think, well, that's more exotic, it's got to be worth more. So if there's fewer of them, they're both good cars. The 3.2 in some situations certainly drives better and is easier to drive. But generally, why is it then that this is worth about the same? It should really be worth more. I think that the reason is it's to do with perceived reliability and the expense of keeping these running. And I'm going to argue that that's not really necessarily the case. Once again, shockingly, I've done a little bit of research. First of all, let's look at how much it would cost to run these cars in terms of normal servicing. Now, I had a look at a couple of independents on both cars, pretty well respected. So the annual service on a 308 runs from about £350 to £450, which isn't a huge amount. An annual service on the 911 is probably about, which is an oil service mainly, is probably about £300. So it is a little bit cheaper, but not something that should make a huge difference. A 3-year service on this, where the belts are done, and a major service on this, they don't exactly match up because this has servicing on 12 and 18,000, no, 12 and 22. I think this has servicing at 18,000 intervals for the belts and every 3 years, but more or less, let's call them major services. So you're looking at, for the Ferrari, £800 for a belt service and £600 for the Porsche for a major service. Now, there is this myth that belt services on all Ferraris are hugely expensive. It is true. On 355s, you have to drop the engine to the belt service. On this, you don't. Because it's a transverse engine, you take out the liner, the wheel liner, you can get to the belt. So it's not an expensive thing to do. So in terms of standard servicing, they really are not miles apart. But let's look at the spares prices, right? Because Ferrari spares are hugely expensive. Well, once again, let me just debunk that myth. It is true for the later Ferraris, I would say 355 onwards, maybe the 348 as well, that some parts really are unbelievably expensive. But 308s in particular, they are actually fairly good value. So let's do a comparison. A full clutch kit for this 308 is £295. A full clutch kit from Rose Passion, by the way, Super Performance is what I'm using for this, which is like, again, they do good quality aftermarket parts, and Rose Passion I was looking for the Porsche, so comparable, again, aftermarket stuff. Clutch kit for the 911, 670, so it's actually more expensive. Front pads on this 308, can you guess how much OE front pads are? £27 for a full set of front pads for the fronts. Front pads for the Porsche, which still I think is pretty reasonable, but £98 for an OE set of front pads. Discs for the 308, a set of front discs, £105, won't break the bank. On the 911, 55. So In truth, I haven't gone through the whole list, and of course there will be some things that are a bit more expensive on one and a bit more on the other. But I think that you can see that parts for these are just not prohibitively expensive. So there's the parts issue, there's servicing. But I think that those are issues that aren't really quite valid. They affect people's thinking on these cars, but they're not quite true. I don't think one of these is going to cost you that much more to maintain than one of these, especially if it has been properly looked after and actually used. Cars that are not used and are low mileage, which is what Ferraris tend to be, they only cause trouble. Cars like to be used. Now, perceived reliability, well, that's something else where there is a bit of a gulf between these two. Everybody thinks that 911s are rock solid and never have any issues, and that Ferraris are complete disaster areas. It's not totally true. I had a 911, it was a 964. It had its share of issues. I had to rebuild the engines before 100,000 miles was up. And they do have things. I have to say, they are better built, you know, they are good quality, but these, if they are looked after and well maintained, there is no reason why they shouldn't be reliable. Now, those of you that have seen my series of 20 videos since I bought this car probably think, you're kidding me, aren't you? You've spent hundreds of hours trying to diagnose problems on this. And yes, it's absolutely true, I have been, but this is a car that has been neglected. It was used, but there are a lot of the issues that I've found are all to do with the fact that it wasn't looked after or diagnosed properly in the past. They're relatively simple cars. They're a joy to work on. They're really easy to work on. The parts aren't expensive. I would just say, if you get one, use it. So anyhow, we get back to my original thesis. I think it is a bit odd, if you think about it, that these cars are the same value. This is rarer, it's more exotic, it's a Ferrari. It should really, in theory, be worth a bit more. I've taken you through why I think that is, so I don't think it's completely valid, but hey, that's fine. As long as enthusiasts can buy them. You know, my view is generally with all classics, if they were to fall in value, that's a great thing anyway, because we can all afford them more. The only people who would be upset are the speculators, the ones who buy them because they want to make money on them, and they're not true car enthusiasts anyway. Thank you all so much for watching. Happy Christmas if this goes out before Christmas. If not, I hope you've had a happy Christmas, and look forward to seeing you all for the next video. Thank you very, very much to Al and Gina for coming out in a socially distanced manner, meeting me outside and bringing their car so I could do their video. And I do love this in white. Lovely looking thing. Thank you all. See you soon.